Okay, so here with perspective philosophy, we've obviously had our share of disagreements over the years. Perspective said he wants to kind of both do an opening statement. The topic's going to be name the trait and law of identity. So yeah, just you go ahead and make your statement. You offered that I can make one too. I don't really have that much to say, but yeah, you go ahead, then I'll make mine, then we'll just do back and forth.
Yeah, that's great. So, I guess the first thing I'd like to say is, I am a vegan. Is that now? I am a vegan. I do appreciate the purpose of Name the Trait and its function, its attempt to try and show the logical contradictions in non-vegans' positions when they try and affirm that a certain trait is a justifiable reason to cause animal suffering. And I respect at least the intention behind the argument. And more than that as well, I would like to say that the problems I have with it, I do believe can be resolved. So as I've been looking into it, I do believe that they can be resolved. So the problems that I've seen in the past is essentially, name the trait when it comes up in a debate, I see it as, normally when it's spoken, it's what is true of an animal that if we're true of a human would justify difference in treatment, or stabbing them to death, or whatever, essentially you would like to say it justifies. Now, that isn't so much the problem, although it will have a problem depending upon how we interpret the formal version of name the trait. So in the formal version of name the trait, if I'm right, I hope I've still got the newest and most up-to-date version of name the trait. It says, if your, this is P1, where I have the problem by the way, if your view affirms that a given human is trait equalizable to a given non-human animal, whilst retaining moral value, then your view can only deny the given non-human animal as having moral value under pain of P and not P. It's similar to the first, but it's not identical. The primary difference between them is the term given human and given animal, them two terms. These point to particulars or ostensive uses in which I could say that I have to be in direct relation to a particular human or a particular animal. This is essentially relates to the notions of primal identity or individualism or individualistic identity. So this means that traits can be specific and particular to determinate objects. So you could say this human has moral value while this human doesn't have moral value because of having particular identity X whilst the other has particular identity Y. So this means that this has particular relevance to certain meta-ethics, particular egoism, subjectivism, particularism, and intuitionalism. Intuitionalism are some of the meta-ethics I can foresee issues arising. An example would be an egoist who says that they are the given human and are to be trait equalized to a given animal. So the reason this has a problem depends upon how we take the concept of trait equalization and what we take to be particular identities, which involves the concept of thisness. In other words, the ontological individuality of an object, that it is a particular being which can only be itself. It contains the property, not any other object. It is a determinate, discrete object. So if an egoist was to say that they were the object of the human, they were to say that they are the human, and they were to be trait equalized into a pig, any particular pig, I don't think it matters too much, or anything else for that matter. This could cause a problem if the egoist, for example, chose their ego as they would as the trait, because that would mean that their ego would have to be trait equalized into this pig, which means they would have to become
the pig.
So would they value themselves if they were a pig? Now, the argument seems to say that they would be in contradiction if they were to value themselves as a pig. Now, I don't think this shows a contradiction unless we were to say that the psychological continuity of the individual is part of their ego. So, the idea is that unless this individual, if they were suddenly a pig and had all of the human, conscious attributes of being a human and having the same ego and the same thought processes as a human, suddenly became a pig, it's not contradictory to say that they would still value themselves, unless they were to say that they wouldn't value themselves if they didn't have the thought processes, the same egoistical understanding of themselves and self-awareness and so on, with other properties that egoists rely upon to have a psychological continuity. If you were to say that they didn't have psychological continuity, though, we would be saying that they became absolutely identical to the pig, which means that there was never a pig in the first place. It would be to say that the individual hasn't actually transformed. They were the pig, or they were both the pig and not the pig at the same time. And this is my issue. So this is why I have divided, I think, the interpretation of name the trait into a strong versus weak name the trait. And I think that is the better way to look at it. Because from my understanding of name the trait, it is assumed that if all traits true of one object are equalized to those true of another, that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects. Now, if those traits that are equalized include notions of primal identity, that we see in something like an ostensive definition of an apple versus another apple, then we would say that there could not be two apples, and non-Euclidean geometry could show this between spheres. That two spheres could be identical if they obtain all of the same traits. This becomes even more clear if we include things such as space-time, historical underpinnings, and so on. And so the point I'm trying to make is that would be the strong name interpretation, where we take trait equalization to mean any trait at all, including primal identity or primal features or characteristics. Whilst weak name the trait would instead have to differentiate and say that it would not include primal, primitive, or individualistic identity, which would mean that there were certain meta-ethics which would implicitly reject P1, such as particular forms of egoism, particularism, intuitionism, and even some forms of subjectivism would reject P1, in which case you would have to argue that there was a different meta-ethical case in the first place before the argument would apply. This is what makes it weak, because you would need a substantive argument that would say that it should apply. However, it would continue to function as normal on robust realism and quasi-realism, or any other theory based on universal generalizations. So I hope that explains my position, how I think it could be resolved, and overall the issue with Leibniz's law, the identity of indiscernibles, that if two objects have exactly the same characteristics, they would be indiscernible from one another, and that P1 argues that if a given human is trait equalizable to a non-given human animal whilst retaining moral value, that both the human and the animal must have all of the same traits simultaneously if everything true was equalized. That would be the strong interpretation. So I hope that clarifies my position, and looking to get into it.
Okay, well, I mean, I think I'm just going to forfeit any opening remarks, because I just want to understand what this criticism is supposed to be. So, obviously, the problem you're trying to pick is with P1, right?
Yeah.
And the problem is with the notion of trait equalization?
Yes, just purely trait. Well, the two things that I could say is, because it is a given human and a given animal, which points towards particulars. If you had said humans or animals, it would be less primitive, and you'd have the universal basis in which you'd have, but then you'd need an argument that the individual would have to ascribe to that gives humans moral value, as in all humans. But I think you wanted to move away from that, which is why you changed name of the trait in the first place. But I think that you do lose a lot of the problems with having a given as being able to point to a primitive identity. And then the second thing would be trait equalization. Trait equalization can either be interpreted to be complete, absolute, and total trait equalization between all possible ontological attributes between two beings, or it could be limited to those that are not related to primitive identity.
Okay, well, not trying to offend, but I can't make sense of any of that. So
Okay.
let me just.
I'll try to break it down. It might be the way I'm wording it as well. So,
Well, I
sorry.
could ask something. So
Yeah. Go for
I
it.
just want you to point out where the weirdness is. Okay. So we have one possible world, and then we have another possible world. In the first possible world, there's a human who's being killed, and in the last possible world, the other possible world, there's an animal who's being killed, and there's a series of possible worlds in between. So far, do you see any problem?
No.
Not until not so far. No.
Okay.
It depends though, because we could foresee a problem. If we were to take, do you know a person called Adams?
Sorry, before talking about a problem you foresee, can we just, what I was going to do was just lay out what trait equalization is talking about, and then try to see where you object. So,
Okay.
you don't see an objection if, so far, when I say, here's a possible world where a human is being killed, here's a possible world where an animal is being killed, and there's possible worlds in between those two.
No, not so far.
Okay. Now, say that the worlds in between are just modifications on that first possible world. So we're just going to alter some propositions in that world to be more like the world at the end of the series. So, for example, in the last world, the being who's getting killed has lower intelligence. So one of the possible worlds in between would be a human with lower intelligence being killed. Do you see a problem with this?
No, I don't see a problem.
Okay. So that is what trait equalization is.
Yeah. I understand that. I suppose my problem would be, and if I could give a similar example, let's say someone was to say,
Before you give an example, I thought there was a problem with trait equalization, but it
there
sounds
is,
like
but
you just
there
said
is,
there wasn't.
there is, but it's whether it's whether all traits are being equalized and whether the objects are. So, for example, if we were to say that there was a series of possible worlds in which a human and an animal are being made similar, which demonstrate marginal cases between each until we get to the point of the animal, right? So, like, you've got the one with lower intelligence, maybe diminished self-awareness, and then so on like that, until we reach the point of the animal. The issue would arise if it included a notion of primitive identity. So if there was something that was ontologically distinct about world A that could not be transmuted into another world, or transmuted in such a way that it could be trait equalized, it would implicitly reject P1.
Now that I can't make any sense of.
So
I just don't understand. Like, so is the problem supposed to be that there's a contradiction? Is it a logical problem?
it's a logical problem.
Okay, it's a contradiction.
It would be incoherent to say that. So like it could not logically follow. It would be that the sentence structure, like, if we allow it depends on how we define trait equalization, you see. Because if we say trait equalization is to move all traits.
Sorry, I just want to try to understand what kind of problem we're talking about before we go into talking about problem detail. When you say incoherent, is that supposed to mean that there's a contradiction?
Yeah, there would be a contradiction.
Which propositions form the contradiction?
The contradiction is in the sentence structure of P1. It's incoherent.
What is the contradiction, though?
The contradiction is affirming that you can trait equalize a human and an animal in the form of primitive identities, as it all true, was it all, I'll use your terminology, sorry, that makes it easier, that all traits true of an object to be equalized. That's what forms the contradiction, because you have to say
I'm not asking what leads to the contradiction. I'm asking
that is
what
the contradiction. Like, so you'd say that, like, a human.
Wait, but a contradiction, I'm looking for something that if I formalize it in a formal language, it's going to be false in all possible worlds. So I want something like P and not P.
Okay, that something could be both trait equalized, that something is both trait equalized and not trait equalized simultaneously.
Okay, yeah, so the contradiction is that, that X can be trait equalized and X can't be trait equalized?
The contradiction is that X has been trait equalized and X hasn't been trait equalized.
Okay, X has been trait equalized, and it's not the case that X has been trait equalized.
Yeah.
So, if we say that we have a series of possible worlds, the first has a human being stabbed, the last has an animal being stabbed, setting up that series, that's all we mean by trait equalization. That is trait equalization. So,
I understand that, but
have we set up that series?
the only, well, we haven't went through a particular, what do you mean, like, contextually, like, right now, or do you mean?
Yeah, because I just set up the series, and you said that you don't see a problem with that so far, right? So
I don't see a problem with the notion of trait equalization so long as it excludes certain features of identity, is what I'm trying to express.
But wait, I'm trying to understand how you're getting to the contradiction that something has been trait equalized and it's not the case that it's been trait equalized. So when we say something has been trait equalized, all I take that to mean is that we can set up a trait equalization for this object and some other object. Like we can say, here's this possible world, here's that possible world, here's the ones in between. If you think we can do that, right? We can set up that series.
I think you can, depending upon you can't set it up with all things true of an object. You can with multiple, for example.
What do you mean when you say that?
So, for example, you couldn't take, you couldn't turn, let's say, if I was to say a given human, let's say me, and I was to say a given pig, any given pig, you could not trait equalize me with all propositions that are true of me, or all statements that are true of me, could not be trait equalized into that pig. Some could.
Sorry, I mean, you can continue if you want, but like, it's just, I'm already lost, and I feel like when you continue, it's all going over my head, because I'm stuck on something at the start. So, I mean, you can choose. Do you want to continue, or do you want me to try to spell out what I'm not understanding?
Try and spell out what you're not understanding, and then I'll see if I can clarify.
Okay. What I'm not understanding is all I take it to mean to say that we're trait equalizing something, or we have trait equalized something, is just that we've set up a series of possible worlds, where you have the one thing in the first world, the other thing in the last world, and you have a series of worlds in between. So, when we set that up, when I say, here's a world where a human's being stabbed, here's a world where an animal's being stabbed, and there's worlds in between that get kind of closer to that world, right? It's like, here's one where a low intelligence human's being stabbed, here's one where a human with cow appendages is being stabbed, and so on and so forth. When we set that up, that is the first part of what you're trying to say as a contradiction, right? That's the first proposition. X has been trait equalized, right? But I don't see how you get to the second part, that X hasn't been trait equalized.
Okay, so the reason why I'd say that X hasn't been trait equalized is because if we include certain notions of identity, so at one point, let's say we say that, okay, because it's a hypothetical, you can basically play around, you can have like things that don't exist in reality and understand that. So you could have a human or a cow with the psychological continuity of a human, for example. They can have they could have always thought of themselves as being themselves. They've always been human, for example, until they were a cow, and they went through this trait equalization process until they themselves are a cow. Okay? And you could put an egoist in that scenario. You could go, right, well, you are actually metamorphizing into a cow through a series of events, World 1, World 2, World 3. You know, you gain a cow's legs, arms, and then eventually you're fully a cow, except you have a human mind, right? The problem is when
Wait.
you try to put...
The last world has a cow with a human mind?
Yeah, I mean,
That's
as a,
not
as
what
a,
we're
as
talking
a,
about. The last
No,
world
that's
is
the
just a
thing.
cow.
that, you see, that's the point. Like, that would be, what I'm talking about there would be what I would call the weak interpretation of name the trade, where you would say that there would be some aspects in which you recognise that could not be trade equalised without breaking
When
line.
you say can't be trade equalized, I don't understand what you're saying. Like, all we're talking about with trade equalization is here's a world with a human being stabbed, here's a world with an animal being stabbed, there's worlds in between that are a modification on the first world. Now, when you say that the contradiction is that we have and haven't trade equalized, you're saying that both of those things are true, right? So, the first part, that we have trade equalized, I agree that's true, because we say, here's the first world, here's the last world, here's the worlds in between, right? So we agree that's true, correct?
Yeah.
Now, how do you get to we haven't trade equalized? Where does that come from?
So if we were to say, like what you said there, that there is simply a cow at the end with all of the attributes of being a cow, it is simply
Yes.
a cow. It was never you. It could
Yeah.
never have been you. It was a separate discrete object. Yeah.
Of course.
As a separate way. My point is saying that if it was a separate discrete object with the history of being a separate discrete object, that if we were to trade equalize the history of being of having once been you, or if we were to, if we were to trade equalize the or having always been you, it could not have been both the cow in the past and you in the past
Yeah.
at the same time.
Okay, so I think I'm getting closer to seeing what the confusion is. So
Yeah.
the last world is just a cow that's always been a cow. It's not a cow
Yeah.
that was me at some point. It was.
Right.
It's just in a series of worlds, right? When we're talking about me, we're talking about being in some other possible world. We're not talking about something that exists in the history of the cow in the final world. The last world is just a cow.
Okay. So, but if it's a separate discrete object, then when we say trade equalization,
Every
what
world
we're
is a
actually
separate
doing is
discrete
comparing separate possible worlds. Yeah.
Yes, and to be
With
clear,
each
it's
with
not.
their own discrete object.
Yes, right. It's not that somehow it's like the same object in worlds 1 through 99, and then world 100 is a different. It's a different world. It's a different object in each world. We're talking about something with a different identity.
Okay, so let's say like in world 100 it's the cow, and in world 99 it's the human. In
It's not.
world
Sorry, it's not.
no,
it's
sorry,
Not,
in world 99 it's the
It's-
cow with the
it's-
human mind.
in world 99, it's human prime, right? It's not. It's
Yeah.
not the human. It's some other.
Yeah,
being.
that's what I
Everyone
mean.
is its
Sorry.
own being. Okay,
So yeah, I wasn't clear.
it's fine.
Let's say it's like a cow with a human mind, and you're talking to an egoist.
Sorry, you lost me. World 99 is a cow with a human mind?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you're talking to an egoist, and what they're valuing in this scenario is the fact that that cow has their human mind.
Their
And
human
then,
mind?
like, or like, who's that about human mind? Like, whatever human mind they've described in the
A
scenario.
mind that's when we say a human mind, we just mean a mind with the same features as a human. We don't mean the same mind as the human in the first world. Right?
Yeah, sorry, I was describing an egoist who chose themselves as a given human.
Sorry, that lost me. An egoist who chose themselves as the given human. Well, wait, 1 second. We're gonna make things more complicated than we need to if we start talking about when you're the being who's being trade equalized. Let's just talk about when you have like a human who they say they wouldn't stab, right? And they have an animal who they say they would stab. Let's just work with that because that's simple and that's what we're normally running the argument on.
Yeah, I gave egoism. The reason I gave egoism particular merit in this is because it's very particular, and that's very much engaged in this idea of primal identity. But I'm happy to do it with just human. If we take the idea of a human life being in a cow, and that's what they're valuing, and then the human mind is no longer in the cow at world 100. How are they in contradiction if they value the human mind in world 99, but then don't value the cow in world 100?
There's not, you understand, wait, so there's, to answer, there's not necessarily a contradiction, but you understand that name the trait isn't always going to show a contradiction, right?
Well, if their view affirms that it is trait equalizable, I think that's what you said.
No, it's not. I mean, no, it's not the saying that it's trait equalizable that gives the contradiction. It's the trait equalizable while retaining value, and the being in the last world doesn't have value, right? If you say that you can trait equalize A to B while retaining value, that implies that the being in the last world has value. If you say the being in the last world doesn't have value, then you get the contradiction that the being in the last world does and doesn't have value. So to be clear, I'll just repeat for emphasis. It's not that if someone says trait equalization is possible, you get a contradiction, right? I think it's possible. I don't think I'm contradicting myself. The problem, you get a contradiction if you say it's trait equalizable, while retaining value, and the being in the last world doesn't have value.
Right.
So there might have been
I think that
confusion.
maybe the problem has been the fact that when you've described the trait equalization process in the past, I've interpreted it as object A.
Wait, can you stop for a second? Before, because this is what happened with Foot Soldier. When I pointed out to him a simple interpretation that made sense, he started justifying why his past interpretation, where there was some kind of problem, was reasonable for him to take. Now, right now, I'm not arguing with you about whether your past interpretation was reasonable or not. I mean, we can talk about that later if we want. But what we want to clarify right now is if under a proper interpretation, you see a problem. Now,
Well,
under the
we can debate the word proper.
so it's under proper, I just mean the interpretation that I'm offering. So let's remove proper. Let's just say
I
under the
actually want
interpretation.
to delve into this because so what you'd be saying is that in P1, rather than so when we say if your view affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a given non-human while retaining moral value, what you'd be saying is that okay.
Yeah, that
But
the value that
then-
in all of those worlds in the series, in none of them does value is. So then, when you say in the last world, being doesn't have value, you get a contradiction.
Okay. But, like, I guess, like, for the human, this is the point, like, if you were to say universal, because I actually made that point, if you were to talk about pure universals, I don't see a problem if the trait they pick is a universal. So if they say humanity, there's no real problem there with name the trait, because then they can go through each stage, and then eventually you could show like, all right, there's not a you could go like your view doesn't affirm that the cow at the end would have moral value, and then you'd say it hasn't shown a contradiction, and that's fine. But the issue is when there is because of the use of the word given, they can pick something primal or particular. So as I said, with idea of, let's say, if I was to pick...
Can I just keep us right on track? Because the criticism, and sorry, pick up after this, but the criticism was that trade equalization process entails contradiction. And the contradiction is that we have trade equalized, and it's not the case that we've trade equalized. And I could understand what you were trying to get at there, where somehow the being in the last world, like, has its own history and, like, doesn't have its own history, or some weird thing like this. But once we clarify that the being in the last world is just its own being, it's got its own history, it doesn't have the history of the being in the first one, or something like this.
That's essentially what I was offering as a solution. This interpretation, because when I said there's a strong versus weak interpretation of trait equalization, what I was saying is that if we take trait equalization to not include like thisness, primitive features of identity.
What do you mean to not include it? Because you have that feature in the first world, so it's involved in the process. It just goes away somewhere.
But that's the thing, if it goes away, it could not be true of the last object.
And no one
it
says,
says
where has it ever been said that it's true of the last? I don't know exactly what primitive identity means. I'm just taking that to mean that it has the identity, like all of the same properties, including weird, like, trans-world properties, like what world it exists in, as the first object, right? And that's never been my claim at any point. You will never find me on record saying anything of the sort.
Oh, it's just because I'm on the Google Drive on Name the Tree, the deduction V5 map. It says on that one P1 false, and then it is assumed that if all traits true of one object are equalized to the true of another, that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects. So when you said that it goes away somewhere, it couldn't go away somewhere if they're both possessed by some objects. Do you see what I mean?
I think there's a bit of confusion there. So the idea is just say that say that we trait equalize a human to an animal. Okay. Now you understand, in that process, there's certain things that are going to drop off, right? Like intelligence, for example, is going to change, right? At some point, we're going to be talking about a being with lower intelligence. But does the property of being an organism drop off somewhere?
Doesn't seem to.
That's all that I mean, right? If the property doesn't drop off, it's just something the animal has.
Well, then I do have a bit of a problem with the way that's worded.
With the way it's worded, or with because I don't want to. What I want to avoid here is, I think that all you guys have made these, like, what I take to be silly criticisms, but whatever. And whenever I start showing that it just doesn't make any sense under a reasonable interpretation, then it starts turning into, well, here's why my interpretation was reasonable. And I'm not interested in that debate. We can have that debate after.
Yeah, that's
what
fine.
I'm interested in is under my interpretation. Is there an issue?
Okay. I'll be more robust and say that I think that the purple box under P1 is not what you said there then. Because I think
you're telling
the interpretation,
my interpretation
if you were to say
of my
that,
own words
yeah,
is my own
I think that, I think that you wrote that wrong.
well, wait, but the question isn't what interpretation makes more sense to Lewis, right? The question is, which does the interpretation I'm taking have a problem?
Well, I guess it's whether the words themselves mean what they're supposed to mean. Because if you said that all traits true of one.
Sorry, this is a shift of debate topic. What I want to know is if under the interpretation that I am taking, if there is a problem. Now, I've told you what I meant, and
the
your
interpretation
reaction...
that you said, I actually don't see that much of a problem with. But that's what I was offering as a solution, actually. But then I will say that you have to understand then that there will be some meta-ethical implications. For example, there will be some meta-ethics that will implicitly deny P1.
Okay, wait, before we... Just 1 second. The problem was supposed to be that there's a contradiction. Right? The contradiction is supposed to be that we have and haven't trait equalized. Now, I don't know how exactly you got to the interpretation you got to, but what you said was that there's something weird about that box. And when I told you how I interpret what's in that box, right, your response was immediately to go, oh, well, that's not like what I took to mean, which I take as meaning, Isaac, under your interpretation, there's no problem. I just had some other one where there was a problem. And if we want to just say that's the case, that's fine, and we can just agree to disagree about whose interpretation was reasonable. The question I'm interested in is under my interpretation, is there an issue? My interpreration, again, is... I'll finish very quickly.
I don't see an issue. I don't see an issue at all.
Okay. That's fine. Now I want to ask you something. Do you see any other way to get to this contradiction, or was that it?
No, the contradiction exists if we include those things that you said wouldn't be included.
Which is
that it would drop off.
The contradiction exists under an interpretation that I don't take.
Yeah, kind of. Essentially, that's the offer that is the separate interpretation.
You know you can make that criticism of any argument, right? You can always say, under an interpretation other than... You can always say there is another interpretation where there's a problem, right? The question is...
I agree. I guess my point would be
So if a criticism applies to all arguments, it's not a good criticism.
When it's read, I guess my point would be that the reason I wrote both the strong and the weak is because then I think that in terms of your debates, for example, you'd have to understand that there are some meta-ethics that this argument couldn't be, applicable to. So that someone, let's say, like an egoist or particular...
Question. When you say this argument couldn't be applicable to, are you talking about my interpretation is not applicable? Or are you talking about...
Yes, your interpretation.
Okay, so where, and by not applicable, you mean it'll generate contradiction on that meta?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so on what meta-ethic does my interpretation yield a contradiction?
So, if, for example, if we take a particularist who values a given human in world A, or world 1, and then we were to say that what they value includes world 1, being of world 1.
You don't have to be a particularist to value a transworld property. But,
you don't have to be. I just think it's easy that way, because it's like you don't have to like they're very particular.
It actually is not even really relevant. Like you could have pretty much whatever view, and you could value the transworld property.
Well, I actually mentioned this in what I wrote. I said that you could have subjectivists, and you could have.
You have a moral realist who values the transworld property.
Yeah, you could. But I think
not the particularism is intention with realism.
But I think moral realism would have to then give a robust claim as to why being of a certain world was like, for example, an egoist may do that. But okay, we could say egoist, whatever. The point of what I'm trying to say is essentially that if it includes a property that if trait equalized, so if you would have of world 1 and of world 100, like so the cow at the end could not be of both world 1 and world 100, you would agree?
Yeah, of course, but why would my interpretation entail that it would be of world 1 and world 100?
Because if they've said that's morally relevant, and it's being trait equalized, and if all things true of the object are being trait equalized, then that could not possibly be trait equalized, which forces the incoherency.
When we say trait equalized, it sounds like you think that means carried into the final world. Is that what you think trade equalized means?
Yes.
No, my point is that
the transworld property of being in world 1 is only in world 1 on my interpretation, right?
Yeah, but if the whole point is that then if your interpretation takes that if someone was to claim that being of world 1 that they would implicitly is valuable, they would implicitly reject P1. They would not be able to trade equalize. Do you see what I mean?
No. I think there's confusion about what trade equalization means, right?
Okay.
So there's the property of being in world 1, and someone can say that's the trait, right? They value the transworld property of being in world 1. Now, when we talk about trade equalization, it doesn't matter whether you value that or not. That property only exists in world 1, right? There's nothing about valuing that property that entails that we can't. Well, there's nothing about valuing that property that entails that we can't set up a series of possible worlds with variations on the first world towards the last world in between.
But
right?
then,
Valuing
this is my issue. I think there is, because let's say we take, now in world 2, it's not in world 1 anymore.
Right, the transworld property is not true. The property being in world 1 is only true in world 1. Whether you value it or not.
How is it being equalized if that trait cannot be moved through that equalization process?
All it means to equalize is to have one world, another world, and then a series in between where the first becomes more and more like the last. So how did you phrase your question? You said, how is it being trade equalized if it's only in the first world?
If it doesn't include what is being claimed to be morally relevant trait, like if that trait is not being moved from the original world, but is of moral relevancy, how is it being equalized into the last one? Like how is it true of the last object?
It sounds again like you're saying that trade equalization is about properties in the first world somehow being like moved into the last world or something. I'm not sure what exactly.
The only reason I'm saying that is because that is of that particular world.
I don't understand. say that we have intelligence, right, and we equalize a human to an animal. Intelligence drops off somewhere, just like being in World 1 drops off somewhere. How is there an issue?
But like,
Right.
Trade equalization just means you set up that series of worlds. It doesn't mean that there aren't properties that drop off. The whole thing is that properties drop off as you move through the series of worlds. That's the idea.
I try and formulate this in a different way.
Okay.
So,
take your time, like really.
I'm just trying to say it in a way that's not going to be.
No, it's fine. Like honestly, take your time and think it out. Hash it out as long as you need.
Would you say that? Just a quick question. If you were to say that, because it says like, if a viewer affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a given non-human animal whilst retaining moral value. If you were to say that, a given human.
If you say that value is retained throughout the process, but that value is in virtue of a property that only exists in World 1, then that person's just contradicting themselves. They're just saying value is retained through the process, and it's not the case that value is retained through the process.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I mean, I guess the way I would phrase it is that, let's say if we were to ask you a question like, if someone said, let's say, being of World 1, would you say that that is trait like that?
Trade
like,
equalizable
for example,
just means is part of the trade equalization process. That's all it means.
Okay, so, and through this trade equalization process, if someone said self-awareness, how would you walk them through that? Like, just give us an example, just to make sure.
Well, so yeah, that's fine. So the first thing you always want to do when people name traits is to make sure that they fit the category of differential properties. So if someone answers name the trait by saying, well, it's being an organism, that's actually a category error because they're naming something that's true of both beings. It has to be something that's true of one and not the other. That's what we're referring to. So if someone were to say self-awareness, unless they take the view that animals aren't self-aware, in which case then we have to have a separate discussion that's not to do with name the trait about whether animals are self-aware. If they say self-awareness, but they accept that animals are self-aware, that's just a category error. They're not naming something that's a differential property. They're naming something that's a shared property. Or you could make another kind of category error where you name something that's not true of either, right? Like the traits being Superman. Well, humans aren't Superman and animals aren't Superman, so that's not a differential property, right? It has to be something true of one and not the other, not something true of both or neither.
Okay. And okay, so
self-awareness is true of both.
If you were to say something like intelligence to a degree of having an IQ of over 100,
yes, sure.
And the given animal was a cow,
yes,
which had an IQ of, let's say, less than 50. I don't know how actually high IQ.
I don't know, but I follow. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. How would you walk them through that process?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you mean by walk them through, but if you're asking,
well, like, how would you trade equalize them?
Yeah, so at some point in the trade equalization process, intelligence would drop off.
Okay, so if they valued intelligence, and it dropped off at, let's say, World 5, right? Now you have a non-intelligent, like marginal case of a human. And would you say that?
This is someone who's not accepting P2 though. Remember, this argument, and I don't want to throw in too much information here, but this argument is only to be run after asking the first question in the dialogue flow tree. If someone says that, yeah, there's no trait, right? That's setting up P2 as true, right? So if you're talking about someone who's naming the trait, who thinks that there is a point where value drops off, you wouldn't even be running this argument. You'd be in the dialogue flow tree, right? Because that person doesn't accept P2. There is some point where value drops off.
Right.
So
they don't say it's trade equalizable while retaining value. They say it loses value.
The goal of this argument is to show that they will value the cow at the end.
No,
or whatever.
getting into the goal is a bit of a separate thing. Goal, now that in fact that's going to add a lot of baggage, right? Because a goal is that's going to have to do with what someone's intention is when running the argument. So theoretically, someone could have all sorts of weird goals. Someone's goal could be to create a waffle, right? So that they could just
okay. I'll word that differently. I'd say that the function of the argument functions to show a contradiction if the individual values the animal at the end of the trait equalization process, or does not value the animal rather at the end of the trait equalization.
Close, but again, just like earlier when I said it's not just saying that they're trait equalizable that gives you the contradiction. It's not just saying the animal is valuable that gives you the contradiction. Because you and I hold the view that the animal is valuable at the end of the trait equalization process, and I don't think either of us think we're contradicting ourselves. The contradiction comes from the combination of these things, okay? They're trait equalizable, value is retained, but the animal doesn't have value. It's those three, right? And if you answer that first question by, again, I'll just go over to it. On your current worldview, if all traits true of a given human who has moral value are switched to match those true of a given non-human animal who doesn't have moral value, is there any point in the trait equalization process where moral value is lost? If they say no, they're saying the human who has value is equalizable to the animal who doesn't have value. Well, while retaining, let me just walk through that again. I lost my own words. Is there any point in the trait? So they're saying a human who has value is equalizable to an animal who doesn't have value, without value being lost anywhere in the process. So we're getting an affirmation that human has value, animal doesn't, and the human is equalizable to the animal while retaining value, right? So it's when they say no to that first question in the dialogue flow, sorry for the voice crack, that you get the contradiction, right? So the point of the syllogism is just to bar off a no answer to that first question. Because some people, it's very silly when you think about it, but some people will try to say, yeah, one has value, the other doesn't, they're trait equalizable, and value isn't lost anywhere. It's like, wait, but that's just, I'll just give you a contradiction. If value isn't lost anywhere, the being in the last world has value, but you just said it doesn't. That's
right, because you see, like, it seems to me that then P1 is basically saying that, like, for someone to affirm P1, then they would have to be saying that a given human is trait equalizable. So if like an egoist was to pick this up, they would say that, I am trait equalizable to an animal whilst retaining moral value. But then would they not be incoherent in affirming that? Because if they were to say that they were trait equalizable to a human, you'd agree that would be a contradiction, and I would agree too.
I think you might have just spoken incorrectly. You just said trait equalizable to a human. I assume you mean to an animal. Right?
To an animal, yes, sorry.
Say it again, I lost it.
No, it's fine. The point is, if your view affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a non-human animal while retaining moral value. So the point of what they'll be saying is that, let's say Lewis is trait equalizable, so can be slowly converted through a series of, slowly metamorphized through a series of modal worlds to a given non-human animal, and then at the end I would retain moral value. It's almost as if we're saying that
then say the animal does have value.
To affirm that, you would have to be to say that if I were a cow, that they would be incoherent in affirming it, if you see what I'm saying. So they'd be saying, like, if I am a cow, then I have moral value.
Wait, but there's no saying that I am a cow. That's not entailed
anywhere. I think it is for an egoist. This is what I'm trying to say.
I do not think so.
If they say that, like, if they say that, like, that they are trait equalizable, and they accept that part of their traits is a psychological continuity, and that's they would have to basically say that psychological continuity was equalizable, and that could be that psychological continuity could exist within the animal.
No. So that you keep misunderstanding what equalizable means. Equalizable doesn't mean that, like, any given property is going to be retained all the way through to the last world. Equalizable just means that you can perform the trait equalization.
Yeah, right? I guess this is the point I'm trying to make.
For example, drops
if they take a primitive notion of identity as
I don't know what that means. Like, what do you mean by primitive?
So primitive would be like for example, it would be direct relation ostensive. So like if I would say like this
I had
cup,
no idea. Yeah.
so like this cup could only be this cup, if you know what I mean. And it couldn't be. And then if I had a separate cup here, it would have the property of not being that cup.
Yeah.
Those like notions of primitive identity would be to say that there are numerical identity would be like this.
Sorry, I might be able to make it easier to understand for myself. Is there a distinction between identity and primitive identity?
And you could have aspects of identity which are like the reason I'm saying primitive because the idea of primitive identity would be to state that like
make it easy for me, please. Is there a distinction between identity and primitive identity?
Yes.
There can be.
Well, there either is or isn't. They either refer to the same concept or different concepts.
Because identity includes like notions of numerical identity, for example, because there's not a single kind of identity. So if we were to say like there are certain identities, for example, in universals, where I could say they both share the identity of being a cup. Do you see what I mean?
No,
and
I don't. I just don't understand if we're saying that. Look, I understand that you're trying to say that there's a contradiction, that trade equalization has happened and hasn't happened, and you think the contradiction exists on certain meta-ethics, you think it exists on egoism, and you think that that's because...
No, I think that the egoist would implicitly... I think the egoist, if they were being rational, would have to reject P1.
Wait, but that's a different criticism. I thought the criticism... Sorry, one sec, we might have lost track. Let me just clarify. Is the criticism now... Have we dropped the criticism that there's a contradiction, and we're just saying that the egoist just rejects P1?
Yeah, that's my point. Like, if we take the
so it's not. Just to be clear, it's not about a contradiction. You're just saying
it's not about a contradiction. If the egoist could not affirm P1 is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, you mean that the egoist accepts P1, they get a contradiction?
Yes.
Okay, so what would the contradiction
be?
Like the point is that like any egoist, particularist, or anyone who affirms that moral value exists in forms of primitive identity, that this argument couldn't be.
You can't keep using that term if I don't know what it means.
All right. Okay. So any form of like.
If you just say identity, I know what you
mean. Okay,
identity.
Identity. That's fine. If they affirm that it is a particular identity, and that it cannot be. And that they always value the particularity of that identity, that they must always reject P1. And if you were to say that, then there would be only certain applications in which name the trait. Like you could present it to an egoist, and they would probably be very confused. But the point of what I'm saying is that it would only be applicable to certain meta-ethics then. And that's why I described it as the strong versus weak. So like a strong, and that's not to say like in terms of good and bad.
I'll just try to understand that, because this is largely you have the criticism. I'm trying to understand the criticism. So
yeah.
If the criticism is that for an egoist, accepting P1 as true yields a contradiction, I don't see why that would be. You seem to be saying that it's to do with them valuing identity. They value the identity of the being in World 1, that specific identity. Kind of like valuing the trans-world property of being in World 1. It's like they value something that's just specific to World 1. That's supposed to be part of the problem here?
Yes.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that so if we're to say it says if your view affirms that a given human is trade equalizable to a given non-human animal whilst retaining moral value.
Yeah.
So let's say the egoist would have to reject that as they're saying like my view doesn't, in all cases, like at least all, like depending upon, like they might be aware of it, for example.
Sorry,
but if
another question. Are you saying that the egoist is rejecting that their view affirms human is trade equalizable to an animal while retaining moral value?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, but that's rejecting the antecedent of a conditional. That doesn't falsify the conditional.
Yeah, that's what I'm not saying that your argument's wrong now.
You're
I'm
saying
saying
that on egoism,
it's
a
only
contradiction to accept P1.
it's only applicable to certain meta-ethical positions then.
But I'm trying to
See,
understand what the argument of that is.
You see, because like what I had, because in past discussions, and I'm saying if I'm wrong, he said that people's meta-ethical position did not matter.
Yeah, I don't see any meta ethic that would somehow result in a rejection of P1. That's right.
So that so you think any meta-ethic could affirm that their view?
Yeah, well, it's not. P1 isn't about affirming that your view says a human is trait equalizable while retaining value. That's just a claim, like that's just a proposition. It is the case that it's equalizable while retaining value. P1 is a condition that if your view says that, then saying that being in the last world doesn't have value gives you a contradiction. So you don't reject P1 by saying my view doesn't say that they're equalizable while retaining value. That's P2 that says that, right?
Mm-hmm. So you how so when like my I guess okay then I guess we can move on to P2 then actually then it might be better to say P2.
But that's not interesting because P2. So of course you can reject P2. The argument is only meant to be run if you say no to the first question in the dialogue flow tree, right? Which has put you in the category of saying P2 is true, right? There's plenty of people who P2 isn't true for, so the argument never gets run, right? If you start asking someone...
that's essentially what I was trying to say with, like, the weak interpretation. Like, so if I was to say that, like, when I said the weak interpretation, I'd say that, like, all, like, particularists, egoists, and so on would probably be... I think P2 is where there'd be rejection. I think you're right, actually.
Well, no, a particularist...
it would be implicitly rejecting P2,
okay,
in which case the argument's not applicable.
Okay, there's a few things. In fact, there's two. Okay, so first of all, criticism that accepting P1 while being an egoist is a logical contradiction. We're dropping that, right?
Only because of the variation of interpretation where you say trait equalization does not include primitive identity, then it drops off.
Yeah, I don't really care why.
Why
it
doesn't
sounds like an effort to
identity of indiscernibles.
Why just sounds like an effort to justify past interpretation, which I don't care about, right? I'm just asking. So we're not anymore on this claim that if you're an egoist, it's a contradiction to accept P1. We're not saying that anymore.
Not if the interpretation doesn't include, like for example, certain forms of identity.
You can always say, look, you can always say when someone asks you, is it a contradiction to be an X and accept this thing? You can always say, well, under some interpretation, it's a contradiction, right? Because there's infinite interpretations, and you can just pick one that contradicts some proposition entailed by you being.
I don't think. You see, I disagree. I guess I disagree with the idea of there being infinite interpretations.
Okay, okay, but that's. Look, if that's a disagreement,
that's hermeneutics.
Let's just set that aside for a second. Okay, there's a lot of interpretation. Okay, but look, here's the point. Okay, I'm asking about on my interpretation, on the interpretation that I have given.
On your interpretation, there is no problem.
There's no contradiction for an egoist to accept P1 on my interpretation.
On your interpretation as you've given it, no.
Okay, cool. And then you were suggesting that there would be if they accepted P2?
That I would say that they would be incoherent if they accepted P2.
So this is egoists and particularists and...
Yeah, so there are certain meta-ethical views that would implicitly have to reject P2, and so they wouldn't be able to run through the argument.
So you don't think that it's possible to be a particularist and value the animal? And
no. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that there are certain meta-ethical views, depending upon what the person is defending, that would implicitly reject P2. That it would be impossible. It would be impossible to trait equalize.
I thought you just said you're not saying that it's impossible. That sounded like a contradiction. It sounded like you said you're not saying it's impossible, you're saying that it is impossible. Is the claim that it's impossible for an egoist or a particularist for P2 to be true?
I'll say because I gave context. I was saying that, like, for example, not all forms of egoism, particularism, and so on are identical, which we can agree with. There are so many different forms of metaethics under each branch that give a variation of different traits and or value propositions towards individuals, right?
But
Now,
is P2, is it a contradiction for an egoist or a particularist to accept P2?
well, it would be dependent upon their position, wouldn't it?
Well, wait a second. So, if they hold the view that value drops off somewhere, then of course they're going to reject P2. But it's not a contradiction for them to accept it. Right? It's not a contradiction to be an egoist or a particularist and to say, yeah, when we set up that trade equalization, I value all this shit. I value the animal, I value myself, I don't know why we're running it on myself, but I value the human, I value the animal, I value everything in between. An egoist can say that, a particularist can say that, and if they can, then they'd be accepting P2. So, of course, it's possible to reject P2, but it's not in virtue of being an egoist or a particularist that you're rejecting
But
P2.
I'm saying that, I guess what I'm saying is that in virtue of being an egoist, for example, someone would say that because I'm an egoist, that moral value is not retainable whilst being trade equalized. You see what I mean?
It's not because of being an egoist, because it's possible for an egoist to accept P2, right? It's because of what that particular person values.
Well, you see, this is where we disagree. I would say that.
When you say we disagree, you're saying that egoism necessarily entails a rejection of P2?
No, what I'm saying is that like a person's values isn't anything to do with their metaethical position. In terms of, I mean, unless they're a value pluralist and it specifically relates to their values, but that logical, the actual argumentation in terms of the meta.
I need to be clear about what the claim is. Sorry, I don't mean to be rude. Look,
It's okay.
Okay, I'm just getting lost with what you're saying. Are you saying that it's necessarily entailed by egoism and or particularism that P2 is false?
Well, first I would say this. I mean, like, I don't know if all forms of egoism, because you could have social contract theory, which is extrinsic moral value, for example, under an egoist position, which I think.
Let's just.
Your view from the treatment.
Clearly, you could be an egoist and you could value beings in every world in the series.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that you could if you're an egoist, then you would be rejecting the notion of trade equalization as incoherent.
Wait, but now it sounds like we're going back to talking about like P1 also. Like just to be clear, I just need to understand if this is
no. If I'm saying that because when we say that there are
Just think about it. Obviously, someone could be a particularist, and they could, for particular reasons, right? There's no general principle of why they value the beings, right? For particular reasons, they value every being in every world that we're talking about, right? Particularists can say that. There's nothing about being a particularist that means you have to reject P2.
I don't think I actually have an issue. So long as I think that at this point, the only thing I actually have an issue with is with this purple box that says that if all traits true of one object are equalized to those true of another, that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed in both objects.
Do you want me to explain my interpretation again?
Do you know that sphere diagram that you gave where it had two spheres and then all of the things made equal?
Veneer made that's from the animation.
Yeah. I guess the point is that the sphere is actually quite useful because that's an example given in metaphysics about Leibniz law and whether it would be the same sphere in non-Euclidean geometry. The point of what I'm saying is that certain metaethics, if we were to include those traits as being shifted over, would cause them to be the same sphere because it would cause an indiscernible identity. Now, what you're saying is that they wouldn't be shifted over, and that they would actually be lost along the process of trade equalization, in which case I don't have a problem.
Yeah, there are things that are lost and things that aren't. If you equalize me to you, okay, at some point the property of, having a green screen behind you right now is lost, and the property of, being a human isn't lost. There's things that are differential.
I don't think we've really got a problem anymore. I don't even think we've got a problem anymore. Because I think that what I took it as is that all traits true of one object are equalized to those true of another. And I took that as including, like, obviously that they would actually obtain these traits.
Yes,
well, if you're saying that's not the case, then we'll put it down to different interpretations. We can, like, I'm happy to do that.
Sure.
But
there's not a problem on my interpretation.
I will say, if I may, and then this is not a criticism.
Are you saying your interpretation is justified?
Just rewrite that purple box.
Well, the thing is, I don't share your view that box is unclear. But let's just put that aside for a second. We can talk about that if you want, but it sounds like we're almost on board about the argument. We agree.
Yeah, the argument, as far as you've given it at this point, I actually think it's fine.
Okay, and by fine, we mean sound.
Sound.
Okay, great. Well, that's really awesome. I'm happy about that. Do we want to have a whole conversation now about what interpretation is reasonable, or do we want to end? Do we want to talk about some other shit like moral realism? What do you want to do? I'm still free for another. I have a whole hour I can play, so whatever you want to talk about. Or we can end. I don't care. Whatever you prefer, Liz. Thank you for taking the time to work this out and being good faith. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, no problem. I always intend to be in good faith. Like that's actually like I think it's a characteristic of philosophy. I think it's unphilosophical to go into a conversation in bad faith. I think it's if you go into a conversation insincere and you're not pursuing truth, then you're a sophist. You're trying to find contradiction, and you're trying to you're not trying to actually get towards truth. And I think that's how Taylor characterizes sophism as. I think characterizes sophism as being a differing in virtue of moral value in how they're actually approaching the conversation. And I like to hope that at least most of the time I at least try and be sincere as much as possible. I don't think at least I don't intend to be insincere.
I'd have to sure I'll accept that, and I don't know if all motivations other than truth seeking qualify for sophistry. I'd have to think about that. It seems like there could probably be other like noble interpretations that aren't sophistry, but maybe that is the case. I'd have to think about that. But
yeah,
I'm glad we could get on the same page though. That's great. So
yeah.
I appreciate that.
And okay, so if we just have a quick thing about this little purple box.
Sure.
So if I was to say that all traits true of one object are equalized to another, I guess.
Equalized just means we put them in the World Series.
Okay, we'll put them in the World Series. But then it says that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects.
Right.
So you would say that after equalization, they wouldn't actually be there.
I don't know what that means.
So like for example, being off World 1 at World 100 wouldn't actually be there.
Obviously.
Okay, but then how could they be possessed by both objects?
So when we say something is possessed by both, I'll just give an example. I think that's the easiest way, because when I did that before, you seemed to understand and agree. Yeah. So say that we equalize a human to an animal. At some point, does the property of intelligence drop off?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you have to say yes unless you think animals are on a human level like you. But does the property of being an organism drop off?
No.
No, so that's just to say any property that doesn't drop off is a shared property. That's all it's saying.
Okay, and then you could have shared properties, and that's fine. They can be, like, for example, categories are universals and stuff like that. That's great. Now I understand that. Like, for example,
if I follow that, but continue.
Yeah, but if we were to say that if we were to say that if we were to say that we'd have to accept that there are some things that not all traits true, not all some traits could not be in both worlds.
Yeah,
So being a trait world
let
A
me draw a
and
distinction.
world
There's some things
well
that can't be trait. They can't be. There's some things that
that can't be true of both objects.
right. They can't be true of both objects, but that's not the same. The same that they're not trait equalized. Trait equalized just means they're in the process.
But in which case, if they can't be true of both objects, then
And just for people
that-
listening, to clarify, a trait that, for example, can't be true of both objects is existing in world one.
yeah, exactly. That's brilliant. In which case, we would say that, like, so for example, it is assumed that all traits true of one object are equalized to those of another. That any remaining are possessed by both objects. So we would say that, like, for example, trait of being in world 100 that exists in the cow could not exist between both objects as well. So there are
Sorry,
some
I don't
aspects.
know if I got that right. Sorry, continue. No,
So
it's
the human that was in world 1, that is the first object. I'm assuming that is being. Oh, wait a minute, right? Yeah, because that would no longer. So what you would actually be doing at the end, the idea is to say that A equals A. It's a tautology at the end, yeah.
You're just talking about. You just. I mean, I don't know exactly how you mean that, but at the end, you just have the one being in the one world.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. If you just have the one, then there's not two objects. So I guess what's confused us is that you've described two objects, but at the end it feels like there's only one, and it's tautological. You see what I mean?
Two objects refers to the one over here and the one over here in the different worlds.
Yeah.
It's not
which case,
this object is in this world mixing together into a morph being and
it's confusing when you say that any traits remaining after equalization are in both objects, because after trait equalization there's only one object.
It's just to say, like, I mean, I guess I don't know how to be any more simple. Like, all that I mean is what we both agreed makes sense, which is if something drops off, right? Like, say we're talking about intelligence, right? It's like intelligence drops off. It's not a shared property, right? Like, being in world 1 drops off. It's not a shared property. Being an organism doesn't drop off. That is a shared property. It's just to say, if it drops off, it's a shared property. Sorry, so I said that backwards. Ignore that last sentence. If it drops off, it's not a shared property. If it doesn't drop off, it is a shared property.
And I completely get that. And so if it doesn't drop off, then you would say that it was possessed by both objects.
Yes.
Yeah, if it doesn't drop off, then it's a shared property.
Yeah, except you kept saying that when we get to the end of trait equalization, there is just one object, a cow, for example.
Both objects doesn't mean two objects in the last world. Both objects means the object in the first world and the object in the last world.
Exactly, which means that there are some things true of the cow which still could not be true of the human.
Yeah, there are things that are differential, and there are things that are shared, right? So, like, intelligence is going to drop off, right? They don't have the same intelligence. It's not a shared property. Being an organism doesn't.
So you would agree that there are some things. So you would agree that there are some things at the end that are true of the cow that still would not be true of the human.
I mean, there's a whole shitload. It's two different worlds. The human, like, there's intelligence.
Right.
There's morphology. There's I don't know, like the level of self-awareness. Maybe there's like the vocalizations they make. There's like the whole idea is that there's things that aren't the same between the cow and the human.
Then in which case, like, I guess what confused us was it says that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects. Do you see what I mean? So I took it that everything that the cow would have would be within the human at the end because the equalization process has been completed and that they both contain those traits.
I don't know exactly how you mean that, but if the idea is like that the human, like, for some reason, something like being in world 1 is supposed to be a property of both. It's like just no.
Or anything that, like, for example, the cow couldn't the fact that it is a cow, it couldn't have
that's not a shared property. But obviously,
yeah, exactly.
share the property being a cow.
So I guess I would honestly, and I don't know, like, the audience can decide whether I'm right in saying this as well, like, and whether they would understand this the same. But I truly think that if you shouldn't say that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects, because that's not true.
When you say that, it's just like if it doesn't drop off, like intelligence, or sorry, like being an organism, it's something that they both have. Both objects, meaning the one in world 1 and the one in world 100, or however many worlds there are.
I think
if it's still there at the end, then it's something that the first being has also, right?
Yeah, except for the identity of the object at the end, because the identity of the object at the end, if there are two objects and because you say both, it couldn't share that. See what I mean? So it's either one or both. Do you know what I mean?
I'm not sure I followed. It's possible I misspoke, but it's just the idea is there are things that drop off and there are things that don't drop off. So there's things that are shared between the first world and the last world, and there's things that aren't. If they're shared, they don't drop off anywhere. If they're not shared, like for example, like the trans world property, they will drop off somewhere.
Yeah, and I'm actually totally fine with that.
Okay.
But I do not, like, what you've written there does not say that.
I guess I don't see how.
Because what you're saying is that like, if you were to say that anything shared would exist in both objects, at the end, that's fine. If you were to, you would say anything shared would exist in both objects, that's fine. But that's like saying, like, for example, at the start, a human shares the trait of being an organism with the cow. So there would have never been, at the start they would also share them. At the end, so at the start and at the end, they still share those traits. Like that is an unchanging relationship between object in world 1 and world 100.
Yeah, it's just that there's things that drop off and things that don't.
In which case it's like that's fair enough. But then you wouldn't say that, but then you would say that you couldn't say that all traits true of one object. So like all traits true of the end object couldn't be in the first object, because not all. It's a particular set. It's the shared traits. Do you see what I mean?
I'm not sure I see what you mean. It's just you just follow object 1, okay? You equalize object 1 to object 2 over there in that other world. If something drops off, it's not a shared property.
Yep.
If it doesn't drop off,
It's a
it
shared.
is a shared property.
But there was, like, for example, there is something
like
that
the world that we're talking about, the world index, like the trans world property, that drops off, not a shared property. Intelligence, that drops off, not a shared property.
would you
Being an
say that,
organism
like, for
doesn't drop
example,
off.
being
On planet Earth, it doesn't drop off, etc.
so just to clarify, you would say that the cow, so you'd say that the cow, for example, at the end, wouldn't have the property of being of world 100.
The cow at the end, it's in world 100.
Okay, it's in world 100. And
I mean, 100's an arbitrary number in case anyone's literally thinking.
yeah, I know. I got that.
I know you do. I'm just saying for people who end up watching.
So let's say the cow, if that has that property, then you would say that that would not be true, though, of, obviously you agree that it wouldn't be true of the other object.
Yeah, it doesn't. So the initial. Yeah, if the property of being in world 100.
Yeah, could not be true.
Yeah, there again, tons of things are not true of both objects. The
But
intelligence,
being in world 100 happens after the trait equalization process has occurred, yes?
yeah,
So you would say that it was true of one of the objects.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean there.
So
Being in world 100 is true of the cow.
yes. So if that's true of the cow, then how is it that any trait remaining after equalization is possessed by both objects if a trait is true, anything true of a particular object?
Remaining in the first object as we equalize it. It doesn't remain because it wasn't there to start with. So, for remaining is something that was there to start in the first object and didn't go away anywhere. So being in world 100, it's true at the end, but it's not there to start.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're trying to get at. Right, okay, I see what you're trying to get at. Okay.
Yeah, are you thinking I think the confusion is, are you going anything that's true in the last world? Well, it's there,
Yeah.
so it must be true in the first, but that would just mean the first
Yeah, exactly.
world
That's
is
why I
just
would
the
say
cow.
that does not make sense. No, that does not make sense.
Okay.
That's fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, let me read that and see, now that I know what you're getting at, if that phrasing strikes me. I will read this honestly and tell you if that occurs to me or not, okay?
No, it's fair enough. It's
It's
fair enough.
assumed that if all traits true of one object are equalized to those true of another, that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects. Consider the image below. If all traits true of a given human are switched to match what's true of the given non-human animal, A, B, and D would be retained in the human. It is talking pretty clearly about retention there, thereby allowing us to infer that the given non-human animal already possessed those traits. To me, I gotta say, I think it's clear, but I'm not gonna tell you that, you're off in like complete crazyville with your interpretation. I don't think that there's sufficient basis for misinterpretation that I personally feel like I would give another iteration of the argument.
Oh, that's fair enough.
I'll tell you
That's
what,
fair enough.
if I notice
Okay,
some
we can agree to
conceptual,
disagree.
I'll tell you what though, if I notice some conceptual problem that requires a V6 that's actually big enough for that, I'll add that tweak also as just like a bonus, right? 'Cause it's like, that's not enough for me to want to actually give another version of the argument. But I agree that most things you can control for, the more fucking clear you can make it, the better. So if something does come up that is big enough, I'll throw that in there too, and I'll try to make it extremely clear. They're talking about things retained in the first. They're retained.
I guess my main issue,
as in things that were true at the start in the first world.
Yeah, I guess like just if you could just change one thing, I guess I'll just say rather than saying all traits true of one object, you say that all traits true of the first object are equalized to those true of another. That would probably be me fine.
Yeah, I appreciate that is more clear. Again, I don't think that it's sufficiently problematic.
Just because when you say one, I understand.
I understand what you're saying. You don't even need to repeat it. I understand what you're saying, and I'm just replying to it by saying I appreciate that there could be more clarity there, and if I at any point see an issue that's big enough to actually require a revision of this, I'll throw that in. But that alone is not enough for me to want to do a revision. I think that's
fair enough. Fair.
Anything else?
Well, I guess we could do a meta ethics debate whether like I
want to get into that. That's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, not now. I was going to say not now, because I've got to shoot off soon.
Well, I found this a very good faith and reasonable conversation. And if you've always been this good faith, then I've misread you. I'd have to go watch your videos back and see if I can get this same read on you, or if I think they were bad faith. But I appreciate this conversation. And yeah, if you want to set up a future debate on, whatever topic, meta ethics, something like that, that's fine also.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe something like whether if subjectivism is true, whether veganism is meaningless or meaningful.
I definitely don't accept that veganism is meaningless. It's subjective.
Yeah, it isn't. I think that the issues with private language and stuff like that. So yeah.
Could you hear that? My stomach just fucking growled like crazy. Did that come through the mic?
No. I honestly, mine was. I'm starving actually. That's what I'm gonna go and eat actually. It's been a good conversation actually. I don't see. I think with the interpretation that you gave there, and I think a variation. I think a move between. I will say that. I suppose that I guess another thing that I would maybe recommend. I know you didn't make it. Do you know that sphere in which let's see. I'll just see if I can find it.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's the trait swapping animation.
Yeah, the trait swapping animation. I'll just double check if I'm about to say the right thing because I don't want to.
I think we all know what's being talked about.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to check for your own purposes. You want to
just for me own sake that I'm not about to make I'm not being.
Yeah, I thought you were trying to clarify to me what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about.
Right. Right. And and so on that animation, you know, the traits are being made so that at the end there is only. See, I guess the way I look at it when I'm looking at the animation is that
You're assuming
seems that
both
there's been-
circles are in the same world.
that that like
Yes.
I would say that like in non-Euclidean geometry, for example, they are the same sphere.
I'll
Uh,
try. I'll try to. Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
Or there are two spheres and something hasn't been equalized. Do you see what I mean?
I think
So-
what you want to think of it more like is two pictures of the same house at the end, right? It's like you're just looking at two
Right.
pictures of the same house.
Okay. In which case, the like, I guess like obviously would say that like we would say that like you know the it can't be two pictures of the same house though at the end because there couldn't be one object like I guess the issue is that like if there was ever one if you would include something like history this is the issue that I have that it could not have occurred.
Is that like a
Sorry.
dog or?
Yeah. Sorry. If there was two pictures of the same house, then we would say that there was always only one house. But if we were to say that there was a trade equalization process, implies like a temporal aspect that something is becoming something
No,
else.
it's a trade equalization isn't temporal. It's across worlds.
Mhm. But that means that. But then when we talk about both objects,
You
it
should
seems
be
like we're
thinking of
talking about.
You should be thinking of it
Like-
like this. You should be thinking of it like you're looking at two possible worlds, and with each change on that sphere, you're looking at a different possible world, and then finally, when they're the same, you're looking at two photos of the same world.
Right. Okay. That I agree with, and I understand. But then, in which case, there is only one object, and there's not both objects. Do you see what I mean?
There's two objects, as in there's an object in the first world, and there's an object in the last world. But if you're saying there's two objects in the last
But then you
world,
said that it has
that's
to
not
drop
the case.
off. But then you say that like something like, then you said that something like transworld identity would have to drop off.
Clearly.
Do you see what I mean?
Unless you like, isn't there a position there of like it's like modal collapse or somewhere? I don't know about that. I think there's views where there's like not different possible worlds, but I don't quite know.
Yeah, like
But forget.
I guess-
forget
I
I
think
even
that-
mentioned that. I don't even know about that shit.
I was gonna say that because I was actually gonna bring up Adams and his talk about like the whether like I think he talks about how like the necessity like how the necessity of identity and how that it doesn't follow that like if it's possible that it's necessary.
Yeah, I think that there's an easy move to deal with any kind of thing like that. Like if someone takes issue with the notion of possible worlds, you can just change to conceptualize worlds or something, and that'll just get out of the problem.
But then, no matter what we do, though, if it's a part of the numerical identity, for example, it has to always, for there to have been two objects, for there to be able to say that there was one and two, must always be a differential basis. If that drops off, then there could have only been one object. Do you see what I'm saying?
I'm not sure. I
Like for one, like for example, for one, like for an apple to exist, in like for example, if there was A and B, for there to have been, if A identity is including the fact that it was once A or has ever been A, then for it to become B, and B includes the notion of it having always been B, then those two could not occur simultaneously.
Yeah, you can't
And
have
I'm doing
something
that.
that was always B and was
Because
always
I'm
not B.
opinion.
That's just obviously a contradiction.
Yeah, in which case there could only be one.
B.
There could only have ever been one. So when you
In the
when you
last
talk
world.
about both objects, for example, when you said like
Lewis, both objects refers to in the last world and the first world. It doesn't say both objects in the last world.
it says after trait equalization, I guess I assumed that you were talking about the object, and maybe perhaps wrongly, when you talked about like was it that any trait remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects, I mean the first and the last. The fact that they are possessing both means that they've both been equalized. But if they've equalized everything, including transworld identity, then there couldn't have been two objects in the first place. Do you see what I mean? So either that's not like
I don't think so. It just means two objects, like in world 1 and in the last world. That's all. It's not saying two objects in the last world. It's just an object over here. Object. But I thought we agreed on it. I thought we had no problem with this.
yeah, but like I guess the point is I'm saying is like with the animation, it's like if you look, it seems that like obviously the first sphere is conforming to the same as the second sphere, right? But if the first sphere, you see that it's differential to the point until the end in which it is exactly the same sphere, and in which case, at the end, you would agree that there was only one object, yeah?
Yeah, I just picture like two pictures of one.
I guess when I read like because you're saying at the end there was only one object, I guess when I read that at the end there's both objects, but you're actually referring to before the trade equalization happened, because
I think I'd have to read my exact phrasing, but it's just like all I can do is just describe what's being talked about. So it's just picture each change on that first object. You're in a new possible world. Change, possible world. Change, possible. And then finally, you get to the last frame. They're the same. They look the same spheres. Just picture being two shots of one, like two pictures of one house.
Yeah, and in which case, like at the end though, that like if they're the same object, there's not been an equalization that's actually happened, because they've always been an object.
Equalization just means equalization is just the process of setting up that series of worlds, right? That's what equalization means. It's just setting up that series.
Right, and each individual world is being counted. So we're not saying that the object is retaining any form of identity as it's passing through.
It doesn't retain identity in the strict logical sense. It's not like it has all the same properties. They have different properties, like just transworld properties are easy. Obviously, you have a different transworld property. So when we're talking about retention, it's kind of like loose. It's like we're just talking about. It's as if you're kind of tracking something because you're talking about the being that is virtually like the being in the last world, except there's some slight differences. We're just tracking that.
That was what was confusing, is because when you talked about retention, it seemed as if at the end it had retained something, but then you were saying that it was a shot of the same world. Do you see what I mean?
Not quite, but like
so
I get that there's some. Sorry.
Yeah, just because it seemed, because when you talked about retention and that it had retained, that's like retention is the ongoing process of comparison, like that it is A, B, moving from A, B, C, D, and that in each process it's retaining. But then at the end, if it's the same object, then there hasn't been anything to retain or change. There's not been a change in the first place, because you said yourself, it's the same object.
Confusion seems to be that you think the word retention implies that like the same identity in the strict logical sense of having all the same properties is somehow maintained through a different world, and that's just obviously a contradiction, because the world is, for example, one of the properties, right? That's the transform.
Yeah, and we agreed that you would obviously, like for example, if for example, if someone said like I value being of world 1, that then that they couldn't, that's not something that is trade equalizable then.
Trade equalizable just means able to be part of the process. It's not something that's retained. It's certainly something.
Okay. Yeah. No. Sorry. That's what I mean. It's not something that could be retained.
Sure. Yeah. I think the confusion has been mixing up trade equalization and retention. I think that's.
I think we're getting somewhere. Like I do think that
we already got somewhere. We agreed that it's down.
Yeah. I think the interpretation you gave me is fine. I think the interpretation you gave me is fine. I think that I still have a problem with the wording of that purple box, because of it's either retention, they're both objects, and I don't think that they can be in the same. It's either retaining or it's not. That's in the strict logical sense of identity, as you said,
you're thinking,
which depends upon the interpretation of the argument.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you're saying that equalization does not include, as was said, notions of primitive identity or like notions of identity, then we don't.
It does, but those things aren't retained. right? We don't want to conflate equalization and
Yeah.
retention. Those things are part of the trade equalization. They are processes or properties, sorry, that show up in some of the worlds, right? But they aren't retained. Those things drop off, right? I didn't hear what you listed, but I know you were just talking about things that are obviously not true in the last world or the first world. Like if you talk about the transworld property, right? It's trade equalized. It's not retained though. Something like being an organism. Okay.
Yeah, because it's not shared, right? But then what I'm saying is that I guess the point is that like at the end you're saying after trade equalization there is actually a shot of one object, and then it says because like obviously if that's part of the process, then what we can say is that the notion of being in a different world is part of the object. In which case, at the end we only have.
Sorry, you lost me. Say it again. The notion of what?
Being part of a certain world is part of the trade equalization process.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
In which case, if that's dropped off, then at the end we'll end up with a shot of one object. And in which case, when we say are possessed by both objects, that implies a duality, like two objects. Do you see what I mean?
Not quite.
Mm-hmm.
The both objects refers to like there's an object in the last world and there's one in the first.
But if you say it's first, then why does it say remaining after equalization or possessed by both objects?
Remaining after equalization, we're just talking about something that doesn't drop off. So like being an organism or being on planet Earth or something.
So you would say, for example, I'll just double check, right? So if it's
If you equalize me to you, being interested in